I'm Brittany, 32 years old, and last Thanksgiving changed the trajectory of my entire life. I'd spent 10 years working my way up in my family's hardware store chain, believing I was building my future. Then, between turkey and pumpkin pie, my father made an announcement that shattered everything. "We're selling the family business to Westfield Retail Group," he said casually. Then he looked directly at me and added, "And Brittany, you're getting nothing." The table fell silent as I sat there, fork suspended in midair, somehow maintaining my composure, while my world collapsed. Before I continue with how this betrayal unfolded, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, hit that subscribe button, and brace yourself for what happened next. Johnson Hardware wasn't just a business in our family. It was our identity, our legacy, our collective purpose. My grandfather, Griffin Johnson, started the first store 50 years ago in our small hometown of Millfield. It was a modest place back then, with creaky wooden floors and narrow aisles packed with everything from nails sold by the pound to fishing tackle. Grandpa Griffin knew every customer by name and often extended store credit to families going through tough times. I grew up hearing stories about how he built that first store with his own hands working after hours while still holding down his day job at the local factory. My earliest memories include sitting on his lap as he taught me the difference between Phillips and flathead screwdrivers. "Pay attention, little Brit," he'd say. "Someday, this might all be yours." When my father Robert took over after Grandpa's retirement, he had bigger visions. Dad was more businessman than handyman with an MBA and ambitious expansion plans. Over 20 years, he grew Johnson Hardware from that single hometown store to 12 locations across 3 states. The business became a regional powerhouse known for its combination of competitive pricing and small-town service. My childhood was shaped by the business. While other kids spent weekends at the mall, I was stocking shelves, learning inventory systems, and eventually working the register. By 13, I could mix paint colors with perfect precision. By 16, I was helping with ordering. The business was in my blood. When it came time for college, there was never any question about my path. I chose business school specifically to prepare for eventually taking over Johnson Hardware. While my classmates debated between consulting firms and startups, I focused on retail management, supply chain optimization, and digital marketing strategies that would modernize our family business. I received offers from several prestigious companies after graduation, opportunities that would have paid significantly more than what awaited me at Johnson Hardware. My roommate Angela took a job with a major consulting firm and started at nearly twice the salary my father offered me. But I never hesitated. The family business was my future, my heritage, my responsibility. For 10 years after college, I poured everything into Johnson Hardware. I started as an assistant manager at our flagship store, determined to learn every aspect of the business from the ground up. I worked weekends, holidays, and late nights during inventory. I knew the name of every full-time employee across all 12 locations. When the pandemic hit, I personally delivered paychecks to staff members who were quarantined. As operations manager for the entire chain, I modernized our systems while preserving the personal touch that distinguished us from big box competitors. I implemented an inventory management system that reduced our costs by 18%. I developed our e-commerce platform, allowing customers to check stock and place orders online, a move that saved us during pandemic lockdowns when our in-store traffic plummeted. My younger brother Tyler took a completely different path. 3 years my junior, he showed zero interest in the family business from day one. While I was learning to use the cash register, he was in his room playing guitar. After high school, he moved to California to pursue music with our parents' blessing and financial support. His band, Monarch District, had modest success in indie circles, but he still required regular cash infusions from our parents to maintain his Los Angeles lifestyle. I never resented Tyler's freedom. We had different passions, different strengths. I genuinely loved the hardware business and felt pride in carrying forward my grandfather's legacy. I assumed my dedication was recognized and valued, especially since customers and employees alike referred to me as the future of Johnson Hardware. Even Dad would introduce me to vendors as the one who'll be running this whole operation someday. Mom was always supportive of my role in the business, though she maintained a traditional position as my father's chief supporter. Eleanor Johnson was the quintessential business wife, hosting dinners for important clients, managing charitable giving in the company's name, and always deferring to Dad's business decisions, even when she privately disagreed with them. Looking back, there were warning signs in the months leading up to that fateful Thanksgiving. Dad began having closed-door meetings with people I didn't recognize, men in expensive suits carrying leather portfolios. When I asked about these visitors, he'd dismiss my questions with vague references to financial planning or consulting services. Our CFO, Harold, who'd been with the company since my grandfather's days, suddenly retired without a proper send-off. His replacement, Monica, was clearly uncomfortable whenever I asked about 5-year projections or expansion plans. "You should discuss that with your father," became her standard response. Dad started missing our weekly operations meetings, something that had never happened before. Store managers began calling me with rumors they'd heard about big changes coming. I confronted Dad about these whispers, but he assured me everything was fine, that I was overreacting to routine business discussions. "Just focus on running the stores, Brittany," he told me. "Let me handle the big picture." I trusted him. He was my father, my boss, my mentor. I never imagined he was systematically cutting me out of the very future he'd promised me since childhood. Our Thanksgiving traditions had always been elaborate affairs befitting a successful business family. My parents' home, a sprawling 6-bedroom colonial on 5 acres outside Millfield, became the showcase for my mother's hosting talents each November. The massive dining room, used only for holidays and business entertaining, would be transformed with her best china crystal and sterling silver, all arranged on the antique mahogany table that had belonged to my great-grandmother. Last Thanksgiving was no different on the surface. Mom had outdone herself with decorations, professional quality floral arrangements, hand-calligraphed place cards, and the family's Waterford crystal glasses polished to perfection. The menu followed our traditional lineup: heritage turkey cornbread stuffing, with my grandmother's secret recipe, 3 kinds of potatoes, and Mom's famous bourbon pecan pie. The guest list was intimate that year. Besides my parents and me, there was Tyler, who had flown in from California with his new girlfriend Megan, a yoga instructor with impossibly perfect posture. My mother's sister Susan and her husband Jim had driven up from Charlotte. My best friend Rachel was there too. She'd been included in family holidays since college, when her parents moved overseas. The early part of the evening progressed with the usual rhythms. Dad mixed his signature old fashions in the living room, while Mom put final touches on the meal. Aunt Susan interrogated Tyler about his music career, while Uncle Jim asked me detailed questions about supply chain issues affecting the hardware industry. Rachel helped in the kitchen, having appointed herself my mother's unofficial sous chef years ago. Dinner began pleasantly enough. The food was delicious, the conversation flowing easily between business talk, family updates, and the occasional political comment quickly redirected by my diplomatic mother. Tyler entertained us with stories about celebrity encounters in LA. Rachel and I exchanged our usual glances when Aunt Susan made her predictably inappropriate comments after her second glass of wine. Nothing indicated that my life was about to implode until my father tapped his crystal glass with a spoon as my mother began serving dessert. The sound cut through the conversation, creating an immediate silence. Dad had always been commanding that way, able to control a room with minimal effort. "Before we dive into Eleanor's magnificent pies, I want to share some news," he announced, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he typically reserved for staff meetings. "After careful consideration, your mother and I have decided to sell Johnson Hardware to Westfield Retail Group. The deal closes next month." The silence that followed was deafening. My fork clattered against china as it slipped from my fingers. Tyler stopped mid-sip, his wineglass suspended. Mom stared down at her plate, avoiding everyone's eyes. I waited for the rest. The part where he'd explain my role in this momentous decision, the transition plan we'd surely discussed in all those meetings. I wasn't invited to my position in the new corporate structure. Instead, he turned to look directly at me, his expression businesslike, almost cold. "And Brittany, before you ask, you're not getting any of the proceeds. Your mother and I are taking the money and retiring to Florida. You need to make your own way now." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt every eye turn to me, waiting for my reaction. Somehow I maintained my composure, though I felt as though I'd been physically struck. "I don't understand." I managed to say, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. We never discussed selling. I've been working toward taking over the business. I've given 10 years. Dad cut me off with a dismissive wave. You've been compensated with a salary for your work just like any other employee. The business belongs to your mother and me. It's our decision to sell. But what about all the promises, all those times you said I would run the company someday? My voice was rising despite my effort to stay calm. I never made any legal promises, he replied coolly. That was just talk about possibilities. Business realities change. Tyler finally found his voice. Dad, that's not fair. Brittany has dedicated her entire career to Johnson Hardware. Life isn't fair, Dad responded without looking at him. Brittany has built good experience that will serve her well in finding another position. Westfield might even keep her on during the transition. The casual cruelty of that statement, the reduction of my decade of dedication to good experience, and the suggestion I might be temporarily retained by the new owners, left me breathless. Robert, perhaps we should discuss this privately with Brittany later, Mom suggested softly, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this devastating announcement. There's nothing more to discuss, he replied firmly. The decision is made. The papers are drawn up. Aunt Susan, never one to stay silent, jumped in. Robert, this seems incredibly harsh. Brittany has been the backbone of that business for years. Everyone knows that. Dad's expression hardened. This is a family matter, Susan. I'd appreciate you keeping your opinions to yourself. The remainder of dessert passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by forced comments about the quality of the pie. Rachel kept shooting me concerned glances while I methodically ate without tasting a single bite, operating on autopilot, while my mind raced through implications, searching for explanations, trying to process the betrayal. As soon as was socially acceptable, guests began making excuses to leave. Aunt Susan hugged me fiercely at the door, whispering, "This isn't right, honey. Don't let him get away with it." Uncle Jim shook my hand with an apologetic expression. Rachel offered to stay to drive me home, but I needed solitude to process what had happened. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. Tears streamed down my face as I navigated familiar streets on instinct alone. 10 years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of believing in the family legacy, all dismissed in a single sentence: you're getting nothing. By the time I parked at my modest apartment complex, the one I'd chosen for its reasonable rent so I could save toward eventually buying into the business, I had moved from shock to the beginning stages of something else. Not quite anger yet, but a dawning realization that everything I'd believed about my place in the family and the business had been an illusion. That night, sleep was impossible. I paced my apartment, alternately crying and fuming, replaying my father's words over and over. My one-bedroom apartment felt suffocating despite its minimalist furnishings. Unlike Tyler's luxury loft in Los Angeles, my home reflected years of financial prudence. IKEA furniture, a television that was several generations behind current technology artwork, limited to framed posters rather than original pieces. I'd always lived below my means, saving diligently for what I believed would be my future investment in Johnson Hardware. The moderate savings account I'd built was substantial for someone my age, but nowhere near enough to buy out a 12-store operation. It had never occurred to me that I would need to. Around midnight, I called Rachel, who answered immediately as if she'd been waiting by her phone. "I still can't believe it," I told her, voice cracking. 10 years, Rach. 10 years of 60-hour weeks of canceling vacations for inventory, of putting the business ahead of everything. It's unforgivable, she agreed. Have there been signs? Anything that might have indicated he was planning this? I described the secretive meetings, the new CFO, the closed-door conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. In retrospect, the signals were obvious, but I'd been too trusting to recognize them. "What will you do?" Rachel asked. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. My entire professional identity is tied to Johnson Hardware. All my experience, my industry connections, my reputation, it's all been built within the family business. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, cycling through confusion, anger, strategic thinking, and back to disbelief. Rachel suggested legal action, but the prospect of suing my own father felt both drastic and futile. Without written promises or contracts, What claim did I really have? I arrived at the main store the next morning with eyes swollen from crying and lack of sleep. I'd almost called in sick, but couldn't bear the thought of seeming defeated. I walked through the familiar front doors of our flagship location, the original store my grandfather had founded, and stopped short at the site before me. 3 men in expensive suits were touring the sales floor led by my father. They were pointing at fixtures, making notes on tablets, discussing the space, as if the employees helping customers were invisible. I recognized the gray-haired man in the center as Edward Westfield himself, CEO of the retail conglomerate, buying our family business. Dad spotted me and frowned slightly before gesturing me over. "Ah, Brittany, good timing. Come meet Edward Westfield and James Williams. Edward is the CEO of Westfield Retail, as you know, and James will be handling the transition of our stores." I shook their hands mechanically, maintaining the professional demeanor that had been ingrained in me since childhood. Edward Westfield gave me a quick once-over before turning back to my father. James Williams, however, held my gaze a moment longer, a flash of something like sympathy crossing his features. "Your father speaks highly of your operational knowledge," Williams said. "We'll want to pick your brain extensively during the transition period." "Of course," I responded automatically, years of business training overriding my personal turmoil. "I'm happy to ensure a smooth handover." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Happy to assist in the dismantling of my family legacy, happy to train my replacements, but professionalism was my armor now, the only dignity left to me. As the men moved toward the lumber section, I overheard a fragment of conversation that stopped my heart. "We'll want to consolidate staff across the overlapping locations," Edward Westfield was saying. "Our models suggest we can reduce headcount by 30% while maintaining operational capacity." 30%. I did the quick math. That meant over 40 dedicated employees would lose their jobs. People like Linda in accounting, who had worked for my grandfather and put her 3 kids through college on her Johnson Hardware salary. Or Marcus in the paint department, whose encyclopedic knowledge of finishes had built a loyal customer base of professional contractors. I followed my father into his office after the Westfield executives moved on to inspect the warehouse. Closing the door firmly behind me, I abandoned all pretense of composure. "How could you do this? Not just to me, but to everyone who's built their lives around this business. People will lose their jobs, Dad." He settled into his leather chair, regarding me with cool detachment. "That's business, Brittany. Companies get acquired, workforces adjust. It happens every day." "Not to family businesses with dedicated employees and loyal customers," I countered. "We're not some faceless corporation. We're Johnson Hardware. Grandpa built this to last generations, not to be liquidated when you decided you wanted a fancier retirement." "Don't be naive," he scoffed. "Your grandfather built this to provide for his family, which is exactly what this sale does. Westfield is paying $50 million. That secures our future, your mother's and mine, and eventually Tyler's." The figure stunned me momentarily. 50 million was far more than I'd imagined the business was worth, but then his last words registered. "Tyler's future. He's never worked a day in the business. I've given 10 years of my life to Johnson Hardware, and you're telling me Tyler gets a share while I get nothing?" My father's expression hardened. "Tyler's trust fund has always been part of our estate planning. He needs that security for his creative pursuits. You, on the other hand, have a marketable skill set. You'll land on your feet." The gender bias was suddenly so obvious. I wondered how I'd never seen it before. My brother, the son, would be provided for regardless of his choices. I, the daughter who had actually committed to the family business, was expected to land on my feet with nothing but a decade of experience and broken promises. "This isn't right," I said, struggling to control my voice. "You know it isn't. This isn't about right or wrong, Brittany. It's just business, not a charity for family members." That phrase, "just business," coming from the man who had taught me that our business was an extension of our family values, our reputation in the community, our legacy, felt like the final betrayal. I left his office without another word needing to escape before I said something unforgivable. In the employee bathroom, I finally broke down completely, sobs racking my body as I leaned against the wall of a toilet stall. I'd given everything to this business, believing I was building my future, only to discover I'd been building my father's exit strategy instead. A gentle knock on the stall door interrupted my breakdown. "Brittany, honey, are you okay?" I recognized Linda's voice immediately. At 62, she'd been with Johnson Hardware since before I was born. I opened the door, not bothering to hide my tears from this woman who had watched me grow up. "My dad's selling the business," I managed to say, "to Westfield Retail Group." Linda's expression confirmed what I already suspected, that rumors had been circulating among the staff. "We've been hearing whispers," she admitted, "but we thought you'd be taking over, not this." "I'm not getting anything," I said, the words still feeling surreal. "Not even a severance package. Just, thanks for your service. Good luck finding a new job." Linda's eyes widened. "That can't be right. Everyone knows this business would be half what it is without you. The expansion into online ordering, the new inventory system, that was all you, not your father." As we talked, Linda shared more rumors from the employee grapevine, that Westfield planned to close at least 3 locations, that they were known for replacing experienced staff with minimum wage workers, that their customer service ratings were abysmal compared to our consistently high marks. After washing my face and regaining my composure, I headed toward the conference room to collect some reports I'd been working on. The door was ajar, and the room appeared empty. I stepped inside only to freeze at the sight of acquisition documents spread across the table, clearly left behind after a meeting I hadn't been invited to attend. I knew I shouldn't look. These were confidential business documents not meant for my eyes. But after a decade of believing I was working toward ownership, after being blindsided by the sale announcement, I felt entitled to understand what was really happening to the business I loved. Quickly scanning the papers, I confirmed the sale price. $50 million in amount that made my modest savings account seem laughably inadequate. But more interesting were the contingencies and timelines laid out in the documentation. The deal wasn't as solid as my father had implied at Thanksgiving. There were still due diligence periods, financing contingencies, transition timelines. Most notably, there was an entire section about key personnel retention that listed me as essential to a successful transition, with a required 6-month minimum employment period post-acquisition. My father hadn't even bothered to tell me that my continued employment was a condition of the sale. I took photos of several key pages with my phone before replacing the documents exactly as I'd found them. Then I made a decision. I needed professional advice from someone who understood family business dynamics and the legal complications that came with them. That afternoon, I called an attorney. Sarah Chen's law office occupied the top floor of one of the few modern buildings in our downtown. Her reception area featured abstract art, sleek furniture, and a view of the river that divided the city. Everything about the space communicated success and confidence, qualities I desperately needed in an advisor right now. The attorney herself matched her surroundings, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, hair pulled back in a perfect chignon expression, alert but compassionate as I explained my situation. "So to summarize," she said after I finished my story, "you've worked in the family business for 10 years, with the verbal understanding that you would eventually take over. Your father has now sold the business without consulting you, explicitly excluded you from any proceeds of the sale, and expects you to continue working through the transition to satisfy the requirements of the acquisition agreement, which you weren't supposed to know about." "That's correct," I confirmed. "I know verbal agreements aren't worth much legally, but there has to be something I can do. This isn't just about the money. It's about fairness, about acknowledgement of my contributions." Sarah tapped her pen thoughtfully against her legal pad. "Family business disputes are among the most complex cases I handle precisely because they blend business and emotional considerations. In pure business terms, your father is correct. If you were compensated with a salary and there are no written agreements about future ownership, your legal standing is limited." My heart sank. "So there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that," she replied with a slight smile. "Verbal agreements can sometimes be enforced, particularly when there's a pattern of behavior supporting them. Did your father make promises about your future ownership in front of witnesses? Are there emails or documents where he references your eventual takeover? Business plans you created together that assume your continued leadership?" I thought carefully. He's introduced me as the future leader of Johnson Hardware to vendors, customers, employees. There are strategic planning documents with my signature alongside his. And my grandfather's original business plan mentioned keeping the business in the family for generations. That's helpful. Sarah nodded. We would need to gather all of that evidence. Emails, witness statements, strategic documents. It won't be easy, but we might be able to establish that an implicit agreement existed. She outlined potential legal strategies, everything from challenging the sale itself to negotiating for a fair portion of the proceeds. The options were complicated, expensive, and would undoubtedly damage family relationships further. Before we proceed with any legal action, Sarah advised, I suggest you gather as much information and documentation as possible. Get your grandfather's original business documents. Collect emails where your father references your future leadership. Speak with longtime employees or family friends who might have heard explicit promises. I spent the next 2 weeks methodically building my case. I searched through years of emails, finding dozens of instances where my father referenced my future leadership. I retrieved the company formation documents from our archives, discovering language about maintaining family ownership when practical. Not legally binding, but potentially useful for establishing intent. I reached out carefully to former employees and family friends, learning that my father had often spoken proudly of my eventual takeover, right up until about a year ago, when his narrative subtly shifted to emphasizing his own ongoing leadership. A difficult phone conversation with Tyler revealed more disturbing context. He never took you seriously as a leader, my brother admitted reluctantly. He'd say things to me like, Brittany's too soft-hearted to make the tough decisions, or she'd run the business based on emotions rather than numbers. Why didn't you tell me this? I demanded, hurt by both my father's assessment and my brother's concealment of it. I thought he was wrong, Tyler said. I've seen how the employees respect you, how you've modernized everything while Dad was still using spreadsheets from the 90s. But he's Dad, you know. He has these old-fashioned ideas about who should run a business. Tyler's guilt over receiving a trust fund while I got nothing was palpable. He even offered to share some of his inheritance with me once it came through. An offer that touched me, but that I immediately declined. This wasn't about money. It was about recognition of my worth and contributions. My mother finally reached out suggesting we meet at a cafe far from both the store and their home. Eleanor Johnson had always been elegant, composed the perfect business wife who supported my father unconditionally in public, while occasionally mediating family disputes in private. Today, she seemed smaller somehow, her usual confidence dimmed. I want you to know I fought against this decision, she said after we ordered coffee. I told your father it was wrong to exclude you after all you've contributed to the business. But you didn't stop him, I pointed out, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. She looked down at her untouched coffee. I've never been able to stop your father once his mind is made up. You know how he is. Why, Mom? Why cut me out completely? Is it because I'm a woman? Because Tyler is the son and I'm just the daughter? Her silence was answer enough. Your father believes you would run the business into the ground with your modern ideas, she finally admitted. The online ordering, the inventory system, the social media marketing, he sees those as distractions from the core business, not improvements. The irony was staggering. The very innovations that had kept Johnson Hardware competitive against big box stores, that had saved us during pandemic lockdowns, were being used against me as evidence of my unsuitability to lead. Those distractions increased our profit margins by 22%, I pointed out. Dad's core business approach was losing market share to Home Depot every quarter, until I implemented those changes. Mom didn't argue the point. We both knew the numbers. As I continued gathering information, an unexpected ally emerged in James Williams, the transition manager from Westfield. During one of our meetings to discuss inventory systems, he surprisingly broached the subject of my situation. Off the record, he said, glancing around to ensure we were alone. This acquisition has some serious problems. Your operational model is completely different from Westfield's standard approach. Half the value of Johnson Hardware is in the customer relationships and staff expertise, exactly what Westfield typically eliminates in the name of standardization. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, suspicious of his motives. "Because I've seen this movie before," he replied. "Westfield buys beloved local businesses, guts what makes them special, then wonders why performance drops. Plus," he hesitated, "I know what it's like to be underestimated by your own father. Mine never thought I'd amount to anything either." He suggested that if I wanted to fight, I should look closely at customer contracts, vendor relationships, and key employee retention. "Many of your commercial accounts have loyalty to you personally, not the Johnson Hardware name. Same with your vendors. If you were to start a competing business," the idea of competing against my own family business had never occurred to me. It felt both treacherous and compelling, a way to preserve what I valued about Johnson Hardware while creating something truly mine. By the end of my 2-week information gathering mission, I had discovered two critical facts. First, many key clients and vendors were indeed unhappy about the acquisition, with several reaching out to me directly to express concerns about continuing their relationships under Westfield management. Second, and potentially more significant, I found in my grandfather's original business journal, a clause stating that family members should have right of first refusal if the business was ever sold. This clause had been incorporated into the original company formation documents, but appeared to be absent from more recent corporate filings. With my evidence assembled, I returned to Sarah Chen's office. After reviewing everything, she looked up with the first genuinely optimistic expression I'd seen on her face. "The right of first refusal clause is significant," she said. "It might have been superseded in later corporate restructuring, but its existence in the original documents gives us leverage. At minimum, your father should have offered you the opportunity to match Westfield's offer before proceeding with the sale." "But I couldn't possibly match $50 million, I pointed out. "True, but legally he should have given you the chance to try. To seek investors, arrange financing, or purchase a portion of the business. By proceeding without this step, he may have violated the corporate bylaws, which could potentially invalidate the entire sale." For the first time since that devastating Thanksgiving announcement, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not that I could stop the sale entirely, that ship had likely sailed, but that I might be able to secure some recognition of my contributions, and perhaps even salvage a piece of the business I loved. My apartment had transformed over the previous weeks. The once minimalist space now resembled a war room, documents taped to walls, spreadsheets, and legal briefs covering every surface, sticky notes marking key points in a complex strategy. I'd barely slept, functioning on coffee and determination, as I prepared for the confrontation that might define my professional future. The research into Westfield Retail Group had been illuminating and disturbing. Their business model was clear-acquire family-owned operations with strong community reputations. Strip away the personalized service elements that made them special but were deemed inefficient, and standardize everything from inventory to staffing levels. The result was typically an initial profit spike, followed by steady decline as customer loyalty evaporated. I'd connected with former employees of other businesses Westfield had acquired. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Experienced staff replaced by minimum wage workers, quality products substituted with cheaper alternatives, community involvement eliminated as an unnecessary expense. This wasn't just about my personal stake anymore. It was about preserving what made Johnson Hardware special, the expertise that helped customers find exactly what they needed, the community involvement that had supported local organizations for generations, the family atmosphere that made employees stay for decades rather than months. The emotional toll of this fight was significant. I'd lost weight, my usual healthy glow replaced by dark circles under my eyes. Rachel had taken to appearing at my door with groceries, insisting I eat something besides protein bars and coffee. "You can't fight effectively if you collapse," she'd remind me forcefully, unplugging my laptop and setting a proper meal in front of me. I'd consulted with a business broker about what it would take to start a competing hardware business. The numbers were daunting, but not impossible, especially with the information James Williams had provided about which Johnson Hardware employees would likely be let go in the acquisition and might be available to join a new venture. Several of our long-term suppliers had reached out privately after hearing rumors of the sale. "We've worked with your family for 20 years, said the representative from Ace Core Tools. "We're not excited about dealing with Westfield's corporate procurement system. If you have other plans, we'd be interested in discussing them. These conversations gave me confidence that I could potentially establish a competing business if necessary, taking with me the relationships and expertise that Westfield was undervaluing. But ideally, I wanted to preserve some portion of the Johnson legacy, rather than starting from scratch. The Sunday before my planned confrontation, my parents invited me to dinner. I accepted with trepidation, unsure of their motives, but hoping for some last-minute reconciliation. The meal was awkward with Mom attempting to maintain normal conversation, while Dad and I exchanged minimal pleasantries. As we finished dessert, Mom made a clumsy attempt at mediation. "I wish you two would talk this through. We're family. There must be a compromise that works for everyone." Dad set down his fork with a definitive click. "There's nothing to discuss. The deal is proceeding as planned. Brittany needs to accept that and move forward professionally." "Move forward to what exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "To working for the company that's dismantling everything our family built, to watching them fire loyal employees and destroy our reputation for service." "Westfield is a successful company with a proven business model," Dad replied stiffly. "Your emotional attachment to the past is clouding your business judgment." The irony of him lecturing me about business judgment when I'd been responsible for most of our growth initiatives over the past 5 years wasn't lost on me. But I held my tongue, saving my arguments for the formal confrontation I was planning. Later that evening, Tyler called unexpectedly. "I've been thinking about this whole situation," he said without preamble. "It's not right what Dad's doing." "Thanks for the moral support," I replied, "but that doesn't change anything." "Maybe it could," he suggested. "I've been talking to Mom. Did you know the trust fund Dad's setting up for me is almost $10 million? That's completely unnecessary. I don't need that kind of money, especially not when you're getting nothing after all your work." I was touched by his support, but firm in my response. "I appreciate the thought, Tyler, but I'm not looking for charity. Not even from you. This is about recognition of my contributions and about honoring the promises that were made to me." "I get that," he said. "Just know that I'm on your side in this. Whatever you need from me, I'm there." Having my brother's support felt significant. For the first time, we were truly allies rather than just siblings pursuing separate paths. The day before my planned confrontation, I made a discovery that changed everything. Reviewing the original company formation documents for the 5th time, I found a clause I'd previously overlooked. One stating that any family member actively working in the business for more than 5 years had a right of first refusal if the business was ever sold. This wasn't just a general principle as I'd initially thought. It was a specific legal provision that applied directly to my situation. And my father had completely ignored it. I called Sarah Chen immediately. After reviewing the clause, she confirmed its significance. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, excitement evident in her normally composed voice. "This clause appears to have never been formally removed from the company bylaws. Your father legally should have offered you the opportunity to match Westfield's offer before proceeding with the sale." "But that would have been impossible," I pointed out again. "I couldn't raise $50 million. "That's irrelevant from a legal standpoint," Sarah explained. "The right of first refusal is a procedural requirement. By skipping this step, your father has potentially violated the company's governance requirements. At minimum, this gives us significant leverage to negotiate for your fair share of the proceeds or possibly a carve-out of some portion of the business." Armed with this crucial information, I finalized my strategy for the confrontation. I would not be emotional. I would not plead. I would present myself as the business professional I was, with legal standing and leverage that could not be dismissed with patronizing references to family talk or business realities. For the first time since that devastating Thanksgiving announcement, I fell asleep without anxiety, confident in my plan and in the justice of my position. The conference room at Johnson Hardware headquarters had witnessed countless business negotiations over the years, but none as personally significant as the one about to unfold. I'd requested a formal meeting with my father, the Westfield executives, and both legal teams citing urgent matters affecting the acquisition timeline, without providing specifics. I arrived early, setting up my presentation materials with methodical precision. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without flashiness, minimal jewelry hair pulled back in a sleek professional style. Every detail was calculated to project confidence and competence. When my father entered with Edward Westfield and their respective attorneys, his expression shifted from mild annoyance to wariness as he noted my formal preparation and the presence of Sarah Chen at my side. "What's this about Brittany?" he asked, clearly irritated by the unexpected complication to his carefully orchestrated deal. "I think it's best if we wait for everyone to be seated," I replied calmly. "This concerns all parties involved in the acquisition." James Williams arrived last, giving me a subtle nod of encouragement as he took his place at the table. When everyone was settled, I began my presentation with the poise of someone who had led countless business meetings, which of course I had. "Thank you all for making time for this discussion." I started, my voice steady. "I've called this meeting to address a significant legal issue with the proposed acquisition of Griffin Hardware by Westfield Retail Group." My father started to interrupt, but I continued smoothly. Specifically, the failure to honor the right of first refusal clause in Johnson Hardware's founding corporate documents, which grants any family member who has worked in the business for more than 5 years the right to match any purchase offer before the business can be sold to outside parties. I distributed copies of the relevant documents, watching as the attorneys immediately began reviewing them with increasing interest. My father's face darkened as he realized the potential impact of this overlooked clause. "This provision appears never to have been removed from the company bylaws during any subsequent reorganization." Sarah Chen added, her tone professional but firm. "As Ms. Johnson has worked in the business for 10 years in various leadership capacities, she clearly qualifies under this provision." Edward Westfield turned to his attorney with a questioning look. After a hurried, whispered conversation, the Westfield lawyer spoke up. "If this clause is indeed still active in the corporate governance documents, it would constitute a significant oversight in the due diligence process." My father's attorney was frantically reviewing his own files. "We need time to verify whether this provision was superseded in later amendments," he said, clearly buying time. "By all means verify," I responded confidently. "But I should note that I've already filed a preliminary injunction request to halt the acquisition pending resolution of this matter. The hearing is scheduled for next week." That was a calculated risk. We had prepared the filing but hadn't actually submitted it yet. But the bluff had the desired effect. My father's face showed the first flicker of genuine concern. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Brittany?" he demanded, abandoning the pretense of business formality. "You can't possibly match Westfield's offer." "That's not the point," I replied evenly. "The point is that I was legally entitled to the opportunity before you proceeded with an outside sale. By denying me that right, you've potentially invalidated the entire acquisition agreement." Edward Westfield looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I think we need to take a brief recess to consult privately," he suggested, clearly unhappy with this unexpected complication. As the Westfield team stepped out to confer, my father remained seated, staring at me with an unreadable expression. When everyone else had left the room, he finally spoke. "Is this really how you want to handle this legal maneuvers and threats? We're family, Brittany." "That's exactly my point, Dad. We're family. I gave 10 years to this business, believing I was working toward my future. I made suggestions that were implemented decisions that increased profitability, sacrifices that benefited the company. And your response was to sell without consulting me and explicitly exclude me from any proceeds. How else should I handle it?" "You wouldn't understand the pressures of running a business this size," he said dismissively. "The constant threats from big box competitors, the narrowing margins, the changing retail landscape. Selling now is the prudent decision." "I understand all of that perfectly well," I countered. "I've been analyzing our competitive position against Home Depot and Lowe's for years. I implemented the online ordering system that increased our margins by 15% during the pandemic. I created the contractor loyalty program that stabilized our commercial revenue stream. What I don't understand is why you never saw me as capable of leading through these challenges." He seemed momentarily taken aback by my detailed knowledge of the business metrics. "It's not that simple," he said, but his usual confidence was wavering. You're too emotionally invested in the old way of doing things. Sometimes tough business decisions require objectivity. Is that what you tell yourself? That cutting me out was a tough business decision rather than a failure to recognize my value? Or is it simpler than that? Is it just that you never believed a daughter could successfully lead the business your father built? The direct question hung in the air between us. For the first time in my memory, my father seemed at a loss for words. Before he could formulate a response, the door opened and the others returned. Edward Westfield spoke first. We've consulted with our legal team, and they advise that this right of first refusal issue could indeed create significant complications and delays for the acquisition. My father started to protest, but Westfield continued, delays which would be costly for all parties and potentially damaging to the business value we're acquiring. James Williams stepped in with an unexpected suggestion. There might be a compromise position worth exploring. The Johnson Hardware portfolio includes 12 locations across 3 states. Perhaps Ms. Johnson could retain ownership of some portion of that portfolio, while Westfield acquires the remainder. All eyes turned to me. This possibility, retaining some portion of the business rather than fighting for financial compensation, hadn't been my primary strategy, but it immediately resonated as the perfect solution. I would be open to discussing such an arrangement, I said carefully, provided the stores I retain would be completely independent operations with no ongoing obligations to Westfield. The next 2 hours involved intense negotiations about which locations would remain with me, how the Johnson Hardware name would be handled, I would rename my portion, and the complex logistics of separating what had been a unified operation. Throughout the discussion, my father remained uncharacteristically quiet, occasionally conferring with his attorney, but offering minimal input. By late afternoon, we had reached a tentative agreement. I would retain 3 stores, including the original location my grandfather had founded. Westfield would acquire the other 9. I would need to secure financing for the portion I was keeping, but at a fraction of the total business value, this suddenly seemed achievable. As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their materials, my father finally approached me directly. You really think you can run these stores profitably as a standalone operation? He asked, his tone hovering between challenge and genuine curiosity. I know I can, I replied without hesitation. I've been effectively running them for years while you focused on expansion. The difference now is that I'll get the credit for their success. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or a reluctant reassessment. You're tougher than I gave you credit for, he said finally. Maybe you do have what it takes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full acknowledgement of his misjudgment. But coming from my father, it was significant. Perhaps the closest thing to respect he was capable of expressing. I learned from watching you, I said, allowing a small smile. Just not the lessons you thought you were teaching. As I gathered my things to leave, James Williams approached with an extended hand. Impressive work today, he said. For what it's worth, I think Westfield is getting the worse end of this deal. The stores you're keeping have the strongest community ties and most loyal customer bases. Thank you for suggesting the compromise, I replied, genuinely grateful for his unexpected alliance. It's a better solution than I had hoped for. Walking out of the headquarters building that evening, I felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, uncertainty about the challenges ahead, lingering hurt about my father's original betrayal, but predominantly a surge of excitement about the future. For the first time, I would be building something truly mine, not just maintaining someone else's vision. The drive home was nothing like that tear-filled journey after Thanksgiving. This time I was already mentally sketching plans, making lists, imagining possibilities. The 3 stores I would retain needed names, new branding, possibly updated layouts. The employees who would stay with me needed reassurance about their futures. The road ahead would be challenging, requiring me to secure financing, establish new vendor relationships independent of the Westfield-acquired locations, and prove that my modern ideas could sustain a profitable business. But for the first time since that devastating Thanksgiving announcement, I felt like myself again, capable, purposeful, and ready to build my own legacy. 3 months after that pivotal negotiation, I sat in my new office watching the installation of the Griffin Hardware sign on the original Johnson Hardware building. I'd named the business after my grandfather, whose right of first refusal clause had ultimately saved my professional future. The logo incorporated elements of his original hand-drawn store sign, creating a sense of heritage while establishing something distinctly mine. The journey to this moment had been intensely challenging. Securing financing had required me to leverage everything I owned, bring in 2 minor investors, and commit to a business plan that left zero margin for error. The legal separation of my 3 stores from the Westfield acquisition had involved countless hours of negotiations over inventory, customer records, and operational systems. Most painfully, I'd had to break the news to employees at all 12 locations about the coming changes. For the 9 stores Westfield was acquiring, I could offer little reassurance about their futures. For my 3 locations, I'd been honest about the challenges ahead, but passionate about my commitment to preserving what made our stores special. To my relief, nearly every employee at my locations had chosen to stay, including many with decades of experience. The business model I developed focused on what Westfield undervalued: personalized expertise, community relationships, and specialized service for both homeowners and professional contractors. While Westfield would likely convert their acquired Johnson Hardware locations to their standardized model, focusing on high-volume, lower-service operations, Griffin Hardware would double down on knowledge and relationships. My father and I had maintained minimal contact during the transition period, communicating primarily through attorneys and accountants as we untangled decades of integrated business operations. My mother had called regularly, clearly trying to mend the family rift while respecting my need for professional independence. As I watched the final letter of the Griffin Hardware sign being secured, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Just landed, heading to your place. Brought champagne." My brother had flown in specifically for what he insisted on calling my grand reopening, though in reality, the stores had never closed during the transition. He'd been surprisingly supportive throughout the process, offering encouragement during late-night phone calls when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. That evening, a small group gathered at my newly purchased house, more modest than I might have afforded if I wasn't pouring every available dollar into the business, but still a place I was proud to call home. Tyler was there with his girlfriend Megan, who turned out to be far more substantial than her yoga instructor persona initially suggested, offering practical advice about brand identity and social media strategy. Rachel came bearing an elaborate charcuterie board and unwavering friendship. Several key employees attended as well, including Linda from accounting, who had been with the company since my grandfather's days and had provided invaluable institutional knowledge during the transition. The most surprising guest was my mother, arriving alone for the first time in my memory. Eleanor Johnson had always been my father's accessory at social functions, their marriage and public personas so intertwined as to be inseparable. Yet here she was bringing a beautiful houseplant and a tentative smile. "Your father sends his regards," she said, as I welcomed her, a statement so diplomatic I almost laughed. "Does he?" I replied skeptically. "Well, not in those words," she admitted with unexpected candor. "But he's been following the transition. He mentioned that your inventory system implementation went smoothly. Coming from my father, that qualified as effusive praise." As we enjoyed Tyler's champagne and Rachel's spectacular food spread, conversation flowed easily between business plans and personal updates. Linda shared stories about my grandfather that I'd never heard before, including his early struggles to secure financing when banks were reluctant to back a first-time business owner. "He would be so proud of you," she told me, eyes bright with emotion. "Not just for fighting for your place, but for how you're honoring his vision of what a hardware store should be in its community." Tyler had begun helping with marketing for Griffin Hardware part-time, discovering an unexpected talent for video content that showcased our expert staff explaining complex home improvement projects. Our social media following had tripled under his guidance, bringing younger customers into stores traditionally frequented by older homeowners. Megan revealed that she had studied business before becoming a yoga instructor and offered thoughtful suggestions about creating in-store events that would build community engagement. People want experiences now, not just purchases, she explained. Monthly workshops on home improvement skills would bring people in and establish your expertise. My mother, initially quiet, gradually became more engaged as the evening progressed. At one point, she pulled me aside to say, "I should have supported you more strongly from the beginning. I've always known how capable you are." "Why didn't you?" I asked directly the question I'd wanted to pose for months. She sighed, looking suddenly tired. 40 years of deferring to your father's business decisions becomes a habit that's hard to break. But watching you these past months has inspired me to find my own voice again. Before I could respond to this unexpected revelation, my phone rang. The screen showed Dad, a call I was tempted to ignore during my celebration. Something made me answer anyway. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Brittany." My father's voice sounded different somehow. Less commanding, more hesitant. "I saw the new sign installation today. Drove by this morning." "And?" I prompted when he fell silent. "It looks good, professional. Griffin would have liked it." Coming from my father, this qualified as effusive praise. "Thank you," I said simply. "I hear from the supplier at Hickman Building Products that you've already increased orders at your locations. Growing already." The fact that he was tracking my business through industry contacts wasn't surprising, but his tone lacked the criticism I would have expected. "Customer response has been strong," I confirmed, "especially to our expanded contractor services program." "Good, that's good." Another pause. "Your brother says you're doing a dinner thing tonight." "Just a small gathering." "Right. Well, I won't keep you." He cleared his throat. "Just wanted to say, the way you handled everything. It was impressive, very businesslike. The closest thing to an apology or acknowledgement I was likely to get." "I learned from watching you." I repeated my statement from our last confrontation, but this time without the edge. "Maybe too well," he said with what sounded almost like a chuckle. "Good luck with the business, Brittany. I mean that." As I rejoined the gathering after the call, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness exactly. The hurt and betrayal were still too fresh, but perhaps the beginning of a new understanding between us. My father had never been able to see me as his business equal while I worked under him. Now, as a competitor of sorts, he was finally beginning to acknowledge my capabilities. The evening continued with planning and storytelling, laughter, and occasional tears. As midnight approached and guests began to leave, Tyler pulled me aside. "I'm really proud of you, sis," he said, more serious than his usual self. "What you've done standing up to Dad, building your own thing, it's incredible. And I'm glad to be part of it, even in a small way." "Your part isn't small," I assured him. "The marketing strategy you're developing is bringing in exactly the new customers we need." He grinned. "Who would have thought all those years of social media addiction would actually become a marketable skill?" After everyone had left, I sat alone on my back porch looking at the stars and reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. From the devastation of that Thanksgiving announcement to now owning my own business, it was a transformation I could never have imagined. The 3 Griffin Hardware stores were already outperforming projections, with customer traffic increasing weekly as word spread about our commitment to service and expertise. Meanwhile, I'd heard through industry contacts that Westfield was struggling with the other locations, facing employee turnover and customer complaints as they implemented their standardized approach. The hardest lesson I'd learned was that sometimes betrayal can lead to something better than blind loyalty ever could. Had my father included me in the original business sale, I likely would have accepted whatever role was offered, continuing to work within constraints set by others. His complete rejection had forced me to envision a different path, one that ultimately aligned better with my own values and vision. I'd implemented a profit-sharing program for long-term employees, something my father had always rejected as unnecessary. The policy had already improved morale and reinforced the family atmosphere I wanted to cultivate. My business plan included community involvement as a core value, not a marketing afterthought with dedicated budget for supporting local organizations and events. Most significantly, I'd found my voice, not just as a business leader, but as a person willing to stand up for her worth. The woman who had sat frozen at that Thanksgiving table, absorbing her father's casual cruelty while maintaining a polite facade, seemed like a different person now. The business challenges ahead remained daunting. I had taken on significant debt to finance my portion of the company. Competition from big box stores continued to intensify. Building a new brand while maintaining customer loyalty would require consistent excellence and innovation. But for the first time, I was building something truly mine, not following someone else's vision or proving my worth to a father who couldn't see it. Griffin Hardware represented not just my professional future, but my personal declaration of independence. As I finally headed to bed that night, I felt at peace with the path ahead, whatever challenges it might bring. Family relationships remained complicated with healing happening in small, imperfect increments. Professional success was not guaranteed, requiring daily commitment and constant adaptation. But I had found something more valuable than either family approval or business achievement: the confidence that came from defining success on my own terms. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth? How did you balance maintaining relationships with fighting for fair treatment? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else facing similar challenges. Don't forget to like this video if you found it meaningful. Subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family business conflicts, and share with anyone who might be struggling to find their own voice in difficult family dynamics. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the doors that close most painfully lead to the opportunities we most needed to find.